Swear to God, by the time that I'm done editing this video, they're going to announce that Warlock is finally nerfed. How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? It's been a minute since I've made a top 5 deck video, and the reason why is because in the previous patch, honestly, you didn't have that much time in order to gather information, and luckily that ended up being a good thing because they ended up having a recent balance patch where they completely scaled back Hunter. But honestly, it's kind of funny because Hunter is still like the best class on HS Replay as of right now. Like, just pulling up the website immediately, we can take a look and see that Hunter is still at a 54 damn near % win rate. And Warlock was on top for a while, but I think that people finally realized that Hunter's actually still fine, even though it does feel like the archetype is a little bit weaker and can be countered a little bit more. But you can't just look at HS Replay and assume that you know exactly what the best deck in the game is, because in my humble opinion, as we hop into the standard best decks in the game, Mage is actually the best deck in all of Hearthstone right now. Now, which Mage deck am I referring to? To most people, this is not surprising, but Naga Mage is actually the best deck in the game, and it's not just because Gabby hit rank 1 Legend with the deck, because honestly, I feel like Gabby could hit rank 1 Legend with a wet paper bag, but regardless, there are a lot of people that are talking about how good Naga Mage is, and this was like the only list that I was seeing people post on the first day of the month. Naga Mage is actually getting so much hate to where even Fino is asking if we can please get some kind of, like, just some nerfs or just straight up delete the deck. Because, you know, the buff never made any sense to him. It's been almost a 2-year deck that got infinite card draw, burn, and removal. Somehow they spend more mana than I do in 4 games and have OTK as well. It's the best that it's ever been. Please just delete it. And honestly, I don't think that this is going to get nerfed anytime soon. Not just because the HS Replay stats have Mage at the absolute bottom, but because this is a very difficult deck in order to pilot, to where I actually took the challenge to really learn the deck, and I think I finally nailed it. I ended up hitting Legend myself with a 28-9 win rate, 76%, and it is important to note that this was at a 10-star bonus, not an 11-star bonus. But if anything, this is just solidify that if you know what you're doing with the Naga Mage, then you can easily make this deck sing and hit whatever rank that you are trying to accomplish. However, being able to know what to do as well as which games you were able to win versus, oh, did I just lose or did I throw? Like, this is one of those decks that really makes you think about your misplays and makes you think about the games that you lost, because there might have been a way to actually win it. It really does feel like Naga Mage has a way to beat almost every single matchup, and I can guarantee you that these Warrior games were probably throws. Like, I really do believe that this is the best deck to be playing right now, but obviously Naga Mage is still very difficult to pilot nonetheless. But that doesn't mean you can't play Sif if you don't want to. Naga Sif Mage and regular Sif Mage are definitely the best decks to be playing right now, although I would argue that Sif Mage is significantly weaker than Naga Mage, because with Naga Mage you have all of the mana cheat with, like, Sif coming down, and then you have, like, a bunch of spells you can cast. With this deck, you need to set up the Nazjar, or you need to have, like, a really good, like, Reverberations turn, or maybe, like, you discover something from the Infinitize, and then have, like, a discounted spell, like, that deals damage, or a discounted reverb, so you can fit in a whole bunch of stuff. This deck is still really good, but Naga Mage really does kind of blow it out of the water, to the point where Naga Mage has overtaken Sif Mage as the most popular deck in Top Legend. However, Top Legend is not exactly, you know, reflective of how well or how good some of these decks perform at all ranks of ladder. So to start off this video, we're going to have the top 10, or I'm sorry, we're going to have the top 5 decks in Top Legend. Then we're going to have the top 5 decks that we have for actual climbing to Legend. And then we also are going to go a step further by going into the top 5 decks of Wild and Twist, in case you guys want to get into those formats. Only reason why I'm showcasing that is because Twist is a new format, as well as Wild being, you know, the new Brawl. So if you want to get a 12-win Brawl, then this is the, you know, a good video that you can use for it, even though I feel like a lot of people have already posted about it. But let's go ahead and continue with the top 5 decks that are currently played in Top Legend Standard. Next up is 30-card Warrior, which I feel like has just absolutely dominated the ladder for quite some time, but Naga Mage has been kind of making this deck fall off a little bit as the best deck in the game. But if you want my honest opinion, this is the best deck in Top Legend that isn't Naga Mage, as well as, like, a really good deck that you can climb to Legend with. And all the decks that are in Top Legend you can definitely play to great success. However, I would argue that some of these decks are a lot harder to play, so if you want an easier Legend grind, the other 5 decks that I'll be highlighting are going to be best for your climb if you're looking for something that's not nearly as challenging. But honestly, Odyn Warrior feels like a pretty decent deck that is not all too difficult, just because of how early you can play Odyn with, like, From the Depths, for example. Absolutely believe that this card is core, and it kind of, you know, drives me crazy that some people don't believe in this card. But this with Finley, forget about it. It's just really good. As well as being able to get the Odyn out on turn 6, you still have the Rift package to push for tempo. You have Ignis in order to give you Wind Fury armor capabilities. This just really does feel like the best deck to be playing right now. And it's also got, you know, Yogg-Saron, so you know that this deck is good, because it really is my opinion that every deck, except for Naga Mage, should run Prison of Yogg-Saron as like a oh shit or like a last resort button, to where if you've lost the game, maybe you can kind of like turn it around thanks to randomness. But this deck is just really good. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about 30-card Warrior, but some of you may be asking, how good is 40-card Warrior? And it turns out that XL Warrior is actually very strong right now as like a pure control deck that aims to sometimes out-armor the other Warrior, as well as just setting up like different forms of tempo with cards like Thori Balor, Steam Guardian, as well as like Khazgoroth. Honestly, I kind of feel like this deck is a bit weaker than 30 Warrior, only because it's that much harder to find the Odyn. But the difference between this deck and the other deck is that this deck is pure control. The other Odyn Warrior is still a control deck at its core, but it's a lot faster and more consistent because of how quickly you can find your Odyn, as well as how quickly you can cycle through the deck and get the cards that you want. Chorus Riff with the other deck only had about 5 minions in here, but there are so many more minions that are in this deck. But this deck does come, you know, prepared for a lot more situations. One thing that I'm kind of wondering if we can maybe fit into this deck is maybe we can put in a Viper. If you don't like the idea of Asvedon, or if you don't have the Dust for him, then that's definitely a card that you can sub in for this. Because personally, I'm not sure how good this card actually is, because it just doesn't see that much play. But this is a card that's popping up in the build of this deck, and I feel like 40 Control Warrior is not that bad if you're wanting to play a pure control deck that is aiming to outgrind and potentially out-fatigue some of the other control decks, as well as some of the aggro decks that you'll be seeing on your climb. But something that I love about this deck is just the Naga Giant. I love this card in the deck because you can get 20 armor, which means you can get 20 attack all in one turn. But regardless, if you want to play a Control Warrior that actually feels like Control Warrior instead of a Combo Warrior, then this is probably the way to do it. The third best deck in Legend is definitely Mech Rogue. It's just a matter of which direction people want to take it. For some reason, this is the most popular Rogue deck that people are playing right now, with Scourge Illusionist pulling out Motherships. But in all honesty, I don't really know how good this deck is, because I don't like the idea of including a Patches-like ability, or it's like, if I draw this card, then I'm just going to feel really bad about it. I don't like the idea of including this card in here, because this deck already kind of lacks card draw to begin with. Like, Gear Shift is a really good form of card draw, but this is like really your only form of massive card draw outside of maybe doing something with Voltron Prime. So like, I really don't like the idea of the Mothership personally, but for some reason this is the most popular deck that is pulling in some numbers. But if you don't like that idea, I actually have an idea about you know, a more aggressive Mech Rogue that I think Astalor doesn't really deserve a spot in this deck. And if you don't like Astalor, I think that Shadow Demise is a very good inclusion in this deck. And it's not even just because you can get value from, like, say, a second from the Scrap Heat, or maybe like a Pit Stop. One way that I love to use Shadow Demise is simply just as another coin if you already have the Coppertail Swoop, or if you have the Coppertail Snoop, or if you already start with the coin in your hand. Because sometimes you can just, you know, essentially play an Innervate and then throw out a Crab on turn 4, a Voltron on turn 4, if you've already got a mech on the field, cheating out a really early Any Stormcoil to get a quick Wind Fury minion, and then magnetizing it is such a powerful thing. And I'm just kind of surprised that, like, this card was seeing actual success in Mech Rogue, and then people just like stopped playing it for some reason. I'm not really sure why that happened, but you can still get a lot of success with Mech Rogue. It's just a matter of which build that you want to play. And honestly, I really like Potion Master Putricide in this deck in order to give this deck like some other ways of being able to win with the random concoctions. But in all honesty, I think that this is the version to be playing. But the Deathrattle variant, I guess, has some potential, but just me personally, I don't like the idea of putting a Patches in my deck to where if I draw it, I'm just going to feel that much worse about it. Next up, we have the Pure Control Warlock, which is probably the best deck in Legend, as well as grinding to Legend, until you start to reach top 1000. The reason why this deck is starting to fall out of favor in top 1000 Legend is because of the Naga Mage, the Naga Mage common matchup, to where you really don't want that matchup. Like, this deck really doesn't have ways of fighting against it unless you get a well-timed Doomkin. Symphony of Sins finds the Titan and cheats it out as soon as you can, or maybe Blade Master Okani can come down at the right time. There are ways that this deck can pressure with, like, Forge of Wills into, like, some 7/7s, but if you want my honest opinion, Control Warlock numbers are going down because Naga Mage numbers are going up at top Legend. But going to Legend, this deck feels like a powerhouse right now. And honestly, there are 3 Warlock decks in this video that I will be showcasing, and the next one is definitely going to be Curselock, because you could play Curselock or you could play Control Warlock, and it is essentially the same matchups, kind of. Curse Warlock does have some matchups it does feel a little bit better into, like the decks that try to kill you faster, because you do have ways of being able to heal as well as deal damage because of the curses. But in all honesty, this deck just feels really solid as, like, the way to play pure control in the Warlock archetype. And honestly, something that I feel like is very underutilized is if you don't OTK this Control Warlock, it has so much healing. It has the Tentacle, it has the Watcher of the Sun, it has Mortal Eradication, it has Ignis for potential lifesteal, you have Symphony of Sins for lifesteal, you have Darkhan. This deck is constantly healing itself, and I didn't even include the Drain Soul, the Armor Vendor, and the Astalorb possibilities as well. This deck has so much lifesteal, and I'm pretty sure this is the reason why OTK is starting to take favor at top Legend, because we need a way to kill this Warlock deck, and you really can't grind this Warlock deck down because everything it does is either killing you or restoring its health. So Control Warlock players, you finally have a good deck to play, and if you want to play some good old-fashioned control games, this is the way to do it. However, if you don't want to drag out the game and you actually want to kill your opponent, you could still play a deck that has a lot of healing, but actively, sets up turns that deal lots of damage. Curse Warlock is an archetype that I feel like is not that common because people are just kind of bored of this archetype. It's really good, so if you're looking for a good deck to play to Legend, I would highly recommend this as, like, a pretty decent deck that not only works at top Legend, but also going to Legend. But this deck is starting to fall out of favor a little bit because and it's not because its power level is bad. I just think that people don't like this archetype because curses are quote-unquote boring for some people. But if you're looking for Curse Warlock deck, this is probably the way to go. Chaotic Consumption and Drone Deconstructor work really well together, as well as Drone Deconstructor working really well with Defile for setups, Tour Guide to obviously help you draw through the deck, and that's the reason why this is in the deck and not in the other one, because you do want to actively draw through your cards because you're not trying to delay the game, you are trying to end the game as quickly as possible with this deck. You still have the Titan high roll with Symphony of Sins, which I feel like just goes in every single deck now. It even goes in freaking aggro Implock, but I do not have aggro Implock on this list because I cannot recommend it. It feels like a really bad deck to be playing right now. But if you like curses, this deck is still as powerful as you want it to be. The next archetype that I can't believe that I'm actually recommending is Control Priest, and it's kind of surprising like how much these numbers have increased, but I think the reason why is because this is still a good control deck that can match itself into other control decks, as well as being able to mitigate some of the other aggro decks you might see on the ladder. However, Control Priest is definitely weak to the Naga Mage Uprising, which is why it's very surprising for me to be seeing this deck and to be recommending it, but the numbers honestly don't lie. That this archetype is getting a lot more popular for some reason, and I'm not particularly sure the reason why it really is getting more popular, but I mean, Dirty Rats as a way of being able to counter combo decks, and Naga Mage, if you happen to steal the Siren, it's pretty much game over, as well as stealing an Odyn. That makes a lot of sense. Love Everlasting with Sister Sylvana makes a lot of sense in order to get even more value in that regard. Also, I really can't talk too much about this deck because I'm completely garbage at playing Control Priest. But, I mean, if you like the idea of playing a control deck that has an answer for everything possible, this is probably the way to go. But one thing that really confuses me about Control Priest is how exactly you win a game if you're not just actively killing them by having a board that never goes away. I guess maybe you have Astalor combos with Synchronize as a possibility. Obviously, Love Everlasting with the Sister for infinite value to eventually find a card that'll kill your opponent. That can maybe work out. There's probably the high possibility that Ignis is like your main win condition, so that way you go for like a 10 mana weapon. You get the 5/6 weapon that can eventually deal 30 damage by itself, and maybe if you get Wind Fury, you can kill your opponent a little bit faster. But in all honesty, I feel like this is just a classic control deck to where This works pretty decently against decks maybe like Pure Paladin or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong on that stat. I'm really not sure about this. But the numbers that I've been seeing about Control Priest have just been steadily going up since the Hunter matchup has become a little bit easier. I think that's the reason, actually, yeah, why this deck is becoming more popular, is because it's not that Hunter is bad now, it's just not nearly as common, and Hound Hunter, for example, kind of messed up a lot of Control Priest game plans, because Hound Hunter could deal just so much damage to the Priest, but now they can mitigate it a little bit easier. So that has kind of given Priest, Priest a little bit more breathing room in the meta. But I honestly I can't recommend this deck because I just don't see how it wins personally. But it's very impressive to see the numbers of Control Priest steadily increasing. So if you like this archetype, first of all, I recommend seeing a therapist. Second of all, you can probably get some good success with this deck. Last but not least, the 5th most popular archetype in Legend right now is actually Nature Shaman. However, there are some people that are saying that Altered Chords are bad and Double Turn the Tides and Double Overdraft are the way to play this deck. Honestly, I feel like the Altered Chords have some potential in this deck, especially if you're seeing a lot of aggro, because the key with this deck is knowing when to OTK and when to go for tempo. Because obviously if you're going up against an aggressive deck, you don't need the full 30 damage combo to kill your opponent. You can play minions, you can hit them in the face to where you can maybe deal like a 20, maybe 15 damage combo all in one turn, which is significantly easier. But one thing we definitely have to talk about is the Jazz base. Chisla's out, Jazz base is in, and it's really just because the Bioluminescence nerf really did hit this deck pretty hard. A lot harder than most one-mana nerfs that we've seen in the past, and obviously in other patches as well, like one-mana nerfs in Hunter really didn't make that much of a difference. They literally had to change how some of those cards were being played. But regardless, Jazz base helps Bioluminescence not feel like that bad of a nerf, but this deck is still very playable at top Legend, and the reason why I'm including it at number 5 in top Legend is because this is a difficult deck to pilot. You can't just do the exact same thing every single game because your opponent's going to be pressuring you, and sometimes you need to focus on breaking some of those combos in order to fight for tempo so you can deal smaller combos to actually kill your opponent. Radiance of Ashara is still absolutely necessary now that Bioluminescence is a little bit more expensive, because the mana cheat is just super important in a deck like this. In case you don't have your Flash of Lightnings, you can maybe use this as like a setup with like Lightning Reflexes, either to find your Flash of Lightnings or to gather the right resources. I would just highly recommend this card, and I know a lot of people are going to be like, do I need to craft this card? Yes. Yes, you do. It's just like, it's similar with Thorim, honestly. Thorim is another card I would highly recommend in this deck, and I know at the beginning of the expansion, I was like, Thorim maybe isn't necessary, but now it definitely is as a way of being able to refill your hand in case you go for the combo and you miss. So that is a little bit important, as well as like being able to set up those turns going into like turn 5, turn 6, so you can play your Inza or your Golganeth. And this is just a good way of being able to unlock your mana crystals in case you are overloaded. But yeah, Thorim, definitely necessary. Radiance of Ashara, definitely necessary. Jazz base is the new core in this deck. Other than that, it is pretty much the exact same deck, and it's kind of surprising how it hasn't really changed all too much. But Nature Shaman is still an extremely good deck. If you want the idea of being a little bit better against aggro, I think that Altered Chord really does have some potential in the deck, and this is the list that I think Fino is still playing right now. But Vicious Syndicate is saying that they don't like the idea of Altered Chord, so you can go ahead and make these changes if you want the deck to feel a little bit more streamlined. But I feel like depending on what meta that you're seeing, you can make an argument for both decks. And now we're getting into the top 5 decks that you can use on your way to Legend in case you don't like the idea of playing a deck that's going to make you have a brain blast every single time that you play it. Because not everybody can play Naga Mage because it's a complicated deck. Not everyone knows how to pilot, Nature Shaman to the point where you're going to have a positive win rate. So if you want an easier deck that is just going to get the job done, Arcane Hunter is still really good, and I believe this is the deck that is really carrying Hunter right now. That and Hound Hunter is really not that much worse, but at the same time, it definitely took a significant hit to where Hound Hunter is still a good deck, but it plays a little bit differently now, but we'll get to that when we talk about Hound Hunter. But if you want the idea, if you like the idea of just playing an aggressive Hunter deck, this is still the nuts. I don't think I need to tell anybody exactly what this deck is doing, but just in case, you have Silvermoon Farstrider as a way of buffing up your Arcane cards in hand. The Brightwing change doesn't even really feel like that much of a nerf. It just feels like a way of being able to slow it down. This is still a fantastic card to throw out on turn 3 or turn 4, depending on if you have the coin or not. But just being able to buff all of your Arcane cards is just super powerful. And it's not like this change killed the card, so to speak. It's not like the Bioluminescence nerf where you kind of have to change how the deck is being played. It just slowed it down, and this deck definitely needed to be slowed down because Starstrung Bow is still making me go crazy. The secret sauce on how you beat this deck is actually to not trigger secrets unless you absolutely have to. Because that's the reason why a lot of people go up against this deck and they just immediately die to this bow. And it's not because they're playing secrets and they're getting value from it. No. You're the one playing into those hidden meanings. You're the one that's taking the chance on being able to give the hunter more value so that way this card comes out faster. Playing around secrets is definitely one of the most complicated, one of the most hardest things to do in Hearthstone, but I definitely believe that it is possible, and this is the reason why Arcane Hunter is starting to fall out of favor at top Legend, why I would not recommend it if you're already in Legend trying to get the best ranks in the game. So I would not be playing Arcane Hunter in top Legend, but if you're trying to get to Legend, this deck is still extremely powerful, and honestly, I feel like a lot of people lose against this deck because they don't know how to play around it, because secrets are just really hard to play around, especially when they are randomly generated. But regardless, Arcane Hunter is still a fantastic archetype to climb the Legend with. Next up, we have Drum Druid, and honestly, I'm surprised that this deck is not more common. I think the reason why this deck is starting to fall out a little bit is because this is a classic deck that just does the exact same thing every single time. You just want a gigantic drum circle that doesn't get removed off the board, and then you have Solar Eclipse into Cultivation. We already know this deck. I made this deck day 1 of Titans, and it is still one of the best Druid decks, so, I mean, hey, man. Let's go. I know Druid. I know how to make a good Druid deck. But yeah, I think that this deck is getting a little bit boring for some people. We've already talked about Astalor as being replaced with a Kiri in case you don't have it for some reason, even though Astalor is 100% a safe craft. But if you don't have the dust, Kiri is at least given to you for free so you can play the deck. This is probably the cheapest deck in all of Hearthstone right now. But regardless, Drum Druid is still doing very well on its way to Legend. But the moment that you hit Legend, it's a little bit harder to get the right wins with this deck, because unless you're going up against Sith Mage a lot of the time, it's kind of complicated to stick a board or maybe to play the Drum Circle as soon as you can. But this deck is still extremely powerful to where if you want to make it work, it can definitely get you to Legend without a problem. Next up, we have Pure Paladin as the third best deck to be playing on your way to Legend. And the reason why this deck starts to really fall off going into top Legend is because I literally have a 100% win rate against Paladin as Naga Mage. The reason why Naga Mage is one of the best ways of being able to counter Paladin is because you out-tempo them, you remove their board, and if Paladin doesn't get a Crusader Aura turn by turn 4 or turn 5, it has no way of beating the Naga Mage after it's popped off. Like, you do have, you know, this Dragon Nord to help, like, remove a board, but half the time I've already won the game by turn 6 as Naga Mage, and just, I think that's really the reason why Pure Paladin is starting to get, like, really bad numbers at top Legend, because all of the best decks in top Legend destroy Pure Paladin. But it doesn't mean that this deck is necessarily bad, it just has a bad matchup going into the best decks of top Legend. But going to Legend, you are going to have a significantly easy climb, because this is the classic 1, 2, 3, 4 deck. You play a 1-drop, you play a 2-drop, you play Boogie Down, you play Crusader Aura. It is really hard in order for some decks to deal with this, especially if Crusader Aura gets played on turn 4 and just solos the game. So, if you want to play this kind of deck, you can. I don't like Pure Paladin, honestly, and you really don't need the Amitis, in all honesty. You could probably cut this card out for anything, in all honesty. You can probably run, like, the Horn if you really want to. Maybe you run, like, a Feast or Famine, or, like, run, like, another buff card, like for Kel'Thalas, for example. But I'm really not sure, like, how good the Amitis is, but the reason why I believe this is in the deck is because of its ability of being able to give your minions +2/+2. You also have the idea of maybe being able to set the attack and health of all enemy minions to 2, and if you already got a board, that feels pretty decent. But the biggest issue with this card is that It's a card that only becomes good if you're already ahead and you're already winning the game. So I would not break your back to try and craft this card, honestly. You could literally put whatever card that you want into this deck, and I feel like it's absolutely fine. If you want my official recommendation, I already said Horn earlier, but I guess you could run like Seal of Blood. You could run the Ferkelpalos. You could run Katori. You could probably run a Seafloor Savior. One card that definitely sees a lot of play is the Jukebox Totem, and I find this extremely funny. But the reason why is because if this minion sticks and you keep summoning 1/1s, it works really well to be able to infuse your Biggin, as well as giving you value from Crusader Aura. But regardless, Pure Paladin is still very good. But if you don't like the idea of playing Pure Paladin, there is an Impure Paladin list that actually runs neutral cards that seems to be working pretty effectively. And I feel like the main reason why people are playing this deck is because of Magatha. You want to be able to have good card draw on this kind of deck because it sometimes feels like it runs out of gas. And in the other Paladin deck, you have the Purator, so that works pretty well as being able to get specific cards. But Magatha seems to be like a good card for most people to be running right now if you want to run something that does not just have only Pure Paladin cards in it. In my opinion, I don't like Pure Paladin because it kind of overshadows how good some of these other archetypes are. So I had to include this list because I want to show people that you don't just always have to play the quote-unquote best deck of the class. Like, there are ways to be able to experiment with other Paladin decks, and this is a deck that really does feel good. And the idea of being able to play Snowflipper Penguin, like, come on, I'm gonna put this in the list because it's just funny. But Rancher does work really well with the Crusader Aura, which is, I believe, the main reason why people wanted to go with this archetype, because it's a way to make the Paladin deck sticky if you don't have a lot of your Divine Shield minions, or if you don't get your Boogie Down value. This deck does not run Boogie Down, though, because you want that stickiness with the Rancher, as well as being able to throw out a bunch of little minions alongside it. But Biggin, Crusader Aura, Famished Fool in the deck, which honestly, I'm not too sure about this. If you don't like the idea of running Famished Fool, you can probably put in a Sylvanas, as well as maybe even... what other card would I put in here? Astalor is already in here, but I just really like the idea of Sylvanas in this deck in order to maybe deal with some of the Titan minions, for example. But the other thing about this card being in the deck is that by the time that you get the value out of it, you probably already lost, so maybe Famished Fool is absolutely fine in that regard. But having Magatha and having Famished Fool seems a little bit much, in my opinion. But this is the deck that's on Vicious Syndicate as, like, the other way to play aggro Paladin that isn't pure. So if you want to give yourself a little bit of a challenge while still having a deck that can definitely get you the Legend, I definitely think that this is a safe recommendation. Sitting at my number 4 spot, I definitely think that Chad Warlock is a good deck that can still see play. However, this is more of a scam deck, and scam decks really don't feel that good compared to the control decks that Warlock has right now. But this is still like a pretty good, a still pretty good deck that you can get some wins with. And it's kind of funny how like Thaddeus still sees play in this deck and is still like the best way to make use of this card is in Thaddeus Warlock. But yeah, this is more of a scam deck than it is anything else, and you can definitely get some insane turn 5 value from it. Like, I literally went up against somebody playing this deck completely golden, which probably gave him some extra, extra boosts in RNG or whatever. But they played the Forge of Will into Forge of Will, and then they played Loken, they found the Thaddeus. This was on turn 5, they coined into it, and then they made 2 11/11s alongside the Thaddeus, and then did a whole bunch of other stuff. It didn't feel fair, it never feels fair, but that's just because this deck is an absolute scam. Like, you might as well just call it Scam Warlock at this point. But it's still a powerful deck. I would argue that its consistency is not nearly as good as Control Warlock, but if you're someone that really likes Thaddeus and you think that he was unnecessarily changed, then you could still win with this deck and get some very impressive results with it. Last but not least, Hound Hunter is also pulling some good numbers right now. And honestly, wait a minute, this is not the deck I'd recommend. Wait a minute, this is not the deck I would recommend, like, at all. Why is a bigger Jormungandr not in this deck? I would actually cut out the zombies and put in this card. And the reason why is because obviously there is the value of getting Lorthamar Theron with the King Mukla, but now that Faithful Companions has been kind of changed, it is a lot harder to get like an actual OTK with this card, because unless you somehow set up a Selective Breeder having a King Crush in hand, and then you play Faithful Companions to maybe bring out a King Crush from the hand and from the deck, then the OTK potential of this deck is definitely a lot worse. So having a gigantic monkey that can sometimes deal piercing damage feels absolutely necessary for a deck like this right now. And honestly, I just don't like zombies as a card. Maybe that's a bit of a personal preference. If you do like the idea of zombies, you could probably cut like any card in this deck that you don't feel like sees play. Honestly, I am not a fan of Arlon, but for some reason, every single time I recommend people not to play this card, I go up against Hound Hunter, they play it on turn 4, turn 5 into Wild Seeds, and then it makes a lot of sense on why people think this card is good. But if you don't have the dust for it, I would not bend over backwards for this card. I just really don't like this card in terms of its power level, and now that it has been technically nerfed because of the nerf to the Spirit Fox, being a 2-1 now, it makes a lot of sense why this deck is a little bit weaker, but it is still a very powerful deck that you can get wins with. So if you're someone that thinks that Hollow Hound got unjustifiably changed, then you could still get some success with this deck. Just know that it's going to be a lot harder because the change to Faithful Companions really did hurt this deck's numbers to the point where it is not the best Hunter deck anymore. You could still make the argument that Arcane Hunter was still better than this deck at its prime, but this was like the deck that destroyed people at the lower ranks just because of the lifesteal giving this deck so much, you know, survivability that Hunter really has never had before. So I think that Hound Hunter is still a fantastic deck that can see play, but just be aware that it might feel significantly weaker. But yeah, I would definitely run this card so that way you have another win condition with your gigantic monkey turns. And now it's time to talk about Twist and Wild, which honestly, you delete this card. Just delete this card from the Twist format. Change it. I don't care what needs to happen. This card needs to be dealt with because not only is it destroying Twist in terms of like how balanced the game mode is, if we take a look at Wild, oh my dear sweet Jesus Christ, what is happening right here? A 59% for Warlock in Wild. And the only reason why Warrior is sitting at number 2 is because I feel like Warrior is the only class that can actually deal with Warlock right now. Apparently, even Warrior is seeing a lot of play in Wild right now, and we'll get to that here in a second. But even looking at Twist, you still have, like, the same problem where, like, Rogue is still very good at being able to, you know, build a gigantic board, but Warlock is just so powerful right now because, and this is a big problem I've always had with Discard, is that discarding a card in Warlock is not even a net negative. It is a net positive because you have so many cards that just get value from being discarded. Silverware Golem, Fist of Jaraxxus, Malchezaar's Imp as a way of being able to get card draw. You really don't care about discarding cards, and there's another card in Wild that absolutely breaks Discard Warlock in every single sense. But this is really the best deck to be playing in Twist right now, to the point where I would not be surprised if this just gets completely deleted from the Twist format. And honestly, I feel like this also needs a balance change to where you just got to switch these two numbers. Make this a 3-mana location that can proc 2 times, because I saw a lot of disgusting synergies with this card to where I don't even want to touch Wild, and I literally don't want to touch Twist until this gets changed. Twist is a fantastic game mode. I have to sing its praises, because if Discard Warlock was not just the best deck that was about, you know, 30 to 40% of your games, Twist would feel extremely refreshing, extremely fun, but this card is really bringing it down. But now that I've talked about why I sometimes don't enjoy Twist, let's get into the decks that I actually believe make Twist extremely fun and a very refreshing game mode. Oh wait, before we get into the refreshing games, yes, Jade Rogue is the best deck to be playing right now. However, there is one more deck that I want to showcase, but I literally didn't have enough room in my collection in order to also build that deck. But you can also get away with playing Jade Cthulhu Rogue. Looking on the Donkey website, there's a lot of different decks that you can see with Twist, but honestly, it's not really that different because Discard Warlock is completely ruling. But if we take a look at this deck right here, the link's not working. What's going on with that, Donkey? I'll just go ahead and just, you know, isolate this deck by itself. Rogue, Cthulhu Rogue is doing very well right now, to the point where I really do believe it is one of the best decks to be playing right now, because Eyestalk of Cthulhu is extremely powerful at giving this deck a lot of sustainability, and the reason why the Jade and Cthulhu package works really well together is because it has damage cards, it has lifesteal cards, it is always on the board. Scarab Lord is absolutely broken in every single perspective to where this sees play in every single Rogue deck. Bladed Cthulhu, a really good way of being able to have some awesome removal as well as buffing up your Cthulhu itself. But yeah, this is another way of being able to play a Rogue deck if you like the idea of playing Jade Rogue. And honestly, the only thing I feel like that needs to happen in Twist to make Rogue feel a little bit less oppressive is the Jade Telegram. I recently watched the Zeddy video that kind of broke down how the Twist format kind of works right now, and the thing that a lot of decks don't have is a lot of card draw outside of Warlock and Rogue, and that's the reason why they're the best decks in the format, is because they can consistently cycle through their deck with like a 5-mana sprint, Fan of Knives. They have a lot of card draw that is available to where they're always on the board, and it doesn't really feel like they run out of gas. So that's the reason why the Cthulhu package works really well in this deck, because you can cycle through all of your options and get to those big turns very easily. But Jade Telegram kind of feels like you're beating somebody while they're already down, because it's like, oh, you don't have card draw? Well, let me go ahead and take one more card out of the equation, which makes it so much difficult for some of these other decks to be thriving. So I think that Jade Telegram would also benefit the format if it was just taken out of the format. Just take it out of Twist. It doesn't really see that much play in Wild, so if you just ban it, I feel like this deck really doesn't feel that much worse. It's still really good. It's just that this card is a nail in the coffin, because you could just get rid of like an equality if you're playing Paladin, which is my favorite class to be playing in Twist right now. But Jade Telegram probably needs to go because it is just way too consistent. But Jade Rogue is definitely a big winner for Twist, and is actually a deck I don't mind going up against all too much. And honestly, I don't fault people for playing this deck either. This deck is a lot of fun, and Jade Golems have not been relevant for quite some time, so it's good to go down memory lane. But if you want one of the best decks to be playing in Twist right now, Jade Rogue definitely feels like the way to go. Next up is N'Zoth Warrior, and honestly, if you were somebody that was happy with Sword Eater being in here, guess what? Sword Eater is no longer part of Warrior, and honestly, it has hit its numbers pretty significantly, but I feel like people just don't know what the best Warrior deck to be playing is right now, except Galen apparently hit rank 1 legend with his take on this deck. The game designer Galen, yes, it is that Galen, and he is recommending for people to be playing this deck right now because he just recommends hitting them in the face. Played a bit to get back with Warrior, great against Zoo, expected to be much more solid versus Rogue. If you're struggling against Rogue as Warrior, or any matchup really, the title of deck will help. Hit him in the face. And here's his rank 1 legend shot. Yep, I'm not blocking it. But this is a very powerful deck because it just has a lot of tempo to it. And then N'Zoth can bring back Iron Juggernaut, which is a synergy that is just really freaking funny to me. This card essentially deals 20 to your opponent. And I feel like the reason why this deck is not that bad against Rogue is because the Rogues and the Warlocks are going to be constantly digging through their deck, right? So if you play the Iron Juggernaut, you pretty much have like 20 damage almost guaranteed in a lot of those matchups. So you just need to be able to, you know, destroy key minions that maybe can deal damage. The brawls are probably super helpful against Jade Rogue, but in all honesty, I just don't see how well this deck does against Rogue in particular because they have so much refill. I can kind of see this deck being a little bit good against Discard Warlock, but it is still like the best deck in the game. One other comment that Galen does make about the deck, however, is that I Know a Guy is actually really freaking decent, but a lot of people just don't really play them. Cards that you might not be playing that are great, I Know a Guy, Gramash. Rogue doesn't do that much early, so I Know a Guy into Pompous Thespian, which I believe is a 2-mana 3/2 taunt, which becomes a 4/4 because of I Know a Guy. Let me double check the ability here in a second. But it can often connect for 8 to 12 damage. Grom sets up so many wins as long as you remember to hit them in the head. And yeah, I Know a Guy gives +1/+2, so that's a 4/4 taunt by turn 2. If you happen to high roll that. But if you look at all the taunts that are available in Warrior, there's not really that many taunt cards, but it's kind of hard to filter by cards that, you know, only have taunt because you have cards like Protector in here. But regardless, I think that this deck has a lot of potential and is the new way to play Warrior if you're very sad about Sword Eater being, you know, essentially banished to the Shadow Realm. Now, this is the deck that I have been having the most amount of fun in Twist with. Anyfin Paladin is one of my favorite Paladin archetypes of all time, and is part of the reason why I have so many Paladin wins and why I love this class a lot, because I love my fishy pals. I love Anything Can Happen as like a legitimate combo win condition that plays with tempo the entire time. This is my favorite version of combo decks, where it's not just about, you know, delaying the game till turn 10 so I can play my big card. No. There's setup involved. You gotta play the Murlocs, you gotta not die, you gotta sometimes push damage to the face, and anything can happen with all of the Murlocs dead, including Finja, will give you 23 damage. If your Finja's not there, then it's 22 because of the old Merc guy getting +1 for all the other Murlocs. But then you play the second anything can happen in order to really destroy Warriors, to where I had a really good win rate against Warrior. But let me go ahead and show you my stats with this deck right now. I am 45 and 27 in total, but with all of the rogues and all of the warlocks, it kind of became more difficult once I hit D5. But the climb with this deck to D5 was so freaking good for me. Like, it was just really powerful, everything that this deck could do. And in all honesty, if you don't have Emperor Thorson, and if you don't have the Burn Bristle, you can go ahead and cut these cards for a true silver champion. Just as, like, a way of being able to, you know, get some more damage, get some more healing, and also interact with the board. It's also a free card you're given, so it definitely helps with the cost of the deck. But in all honesty, the reason why I run these cards is because Wicker Flame as a 3/3 instead of a 2/2 is extremely powerful in order to, you know, give our opponent a wall they have to get through. If I play Wicker Burn Bristle into the Doomsayer, for example, that helps protect the Doomsayer to where I can reset the board to maybe set up for an Anything Can Happen turn. The reason why Thorson is pretty good is because you can play 9 mana, Anything Can Happen, or if you have just a handful of cards, you can just discount your entire hand. It's always good to be doing that, especially in a deck that wants to actively throw out its cards. But the main reason why this is in the deck is for the mirror, but you really don't see the mirror all too frequently. If you hit that 9 mana, Anything Can Happen, then you do the combo before your opponent. That's essentially the thought process. But regardless, you don't have to run these cards. However, one card you definitely cannot afford to not run is Enter the Colosseum. This card used to cost 6 mana. It used to cost 6 mana, and now it costs 3 mana, and oh my god, it literally feels like Brawl, except you know what's going to pop out of the Brawl, and even if you have a big minion survive, you have a card like Keeper of Oldemon, which used to cost 4 mana, by the way, same ability, but you can use that to easily mitigate whatever threats your opponent plays. The only way this card becomes bad is if they have a lot of Deathrattle cards. But Pyromancer Equality into Solemn Vigil is a great way to be able to deal with the Scarab Lord if you're worried about rogues. But the thing that really makes the rogue matchup a bit tough is the Eye Stalk of Cthulhu, in all honesty. That is just a big, meaty taunt that gets in the way of the Anything Can Happen, and you have to save Keeper of Oldemon for that Eye Stalk. So Jade Rogue is definitely beatable, but I was seeing a lot more Cthulhu Rogues on my climb to Legend with this deck, to where I have not really been able to climb to Legend in Twist as of right now. I think I'm sitting at rank 5, and I did peak at rank 3 with Anything Can Happen Paladin, but it is really difficult at these ranks in order to climb with the Anyfin deck. But if you want a fun way to be able to play Twist that plays Fishy Friends, I think that Anyfin Murloc Paladin is a very fun deck that I would highly recommend, that brings back a lot of nostalgia for me personally, but it's just a great way to be able to play the game, playing for minions, and having, like, essentially a game plan that works every single time if you set it up properly. And last but kind of actually least, unfortunately, I am going to recommend Freeze Mage as my 5th deck to play in Twist. And it's because Freeze Mage is a combo deck that was like the combo deck that made me think about, do I actually enjoy this archetype? Yes. Yes, I do. I love combo decks, and I will never stop singing their praises. And it also gives you a reason to remember how good Alexstrasza used to be back in the day. And this card is still pretty powerful. The main reason why I started playing this deck is because I thought it would maybe be a way to counteract the Warlock deck. In all honesty, it doesn't really do that well against Warlock unless they hit themselves a lot in the face and you're able to throw your spell damage to their dome. But one matchup that is actually pretty decent is the Rogue matchup if they're not playing Eye Stalk of Cthulhu as early as possible for, you know, a ridiculous amount of stats. Because you have, you know, Frost Nova, you have Blizzard. I put in a Cone of Cold in this deck in order to give this deck a little bit more ways of being able to delay the game. Ice Block is still an obscenely busted card, which it really surprises me how this deck doesn't see more play, but it really does suck against Warlock, because it doesn't matter if you delay a turn, you just don't have a way of being able to kill them set up. But if you have Ice Block, you know, essentially active by the time that you play Alexstrasza, you could pretty much guarantee the OTK going into the next turn, and this is just one of the most nostalgic decks for most people in Hearthstone, which is why I am recommending it. Freeze Mage still feels very good if you know what you are doing with it. It's a little bit of a difficult deck that punishes any kind of misplays that you make, but draw cards, freeze board, play Alex, kill them with the Dome. And Emperor Thorson can also enable a possible OTK, but only if you have the following cards. If you have Alex Straza, Frostbolts, as well as Ice Lances with potentially, wait, is that enough? Wait, that's actually only 14. Okay, I'm actually wrong. So there's no way that you can, like, play Alex into the Frostbolt Ice Lances all in one turn unless you get, like, a double Emperor tick. But honestly, you don't need to go that far. And that's, like, one of the things about Freeze Mage that I love, is that a lot of people think you need to do this all in one turn. You just gotta set it up. You just gotta set up putting your opponent to 15, and then you have, like, double Fireball with a Frostbolt. You have Frostbolt, Ice Lance combos with Blood Mage Thalnos. So don't just throw away your Blood Mage Thalnos as, like, a way to get card draw unless you absolutely have to. This card is very, very important. But if you like the idea of playing Freeze Mage, I would highly recommend playing it in Twist. Oh, now it's time to talk about Wild. The Wild is it's just on fire right now. And the reason why is because Discard Warlock is just obscenely powerful. And it even gets to the point where target dummies see play in this deck because you have a way of being able to, to buff up your entire board. Something that I literally saw on my Brawlzeum run was target dummy into 1-drop, into coin Wicked Whispers to play a Silverware Golem, and then they just had an insane turn 1 board, and I immediately lost the game. Chamber really does, like, exacerbate this deck becoming a problem because you can consistently pick which card you want to discard. Walking Dead even sees play in this deck, even though it's not even that good, but it's still stats that you can summon as early as turn 1, turn 2, especially if you have coin into Chamber. And then there's also Soul Barrage that works really well with the Expired Merchant, and this deck is absolutely toxic and literally made me rage on stream yesterday. If you know me, I don't like the idea of getting mad on my streams, but I literally couldn't help it because this deck was just absolutely tilting me. And what makes it very frustrating is that this is, like, you have another way of being able to play it. Like, it doesn't really matter how you build this deck. It just has, like, the perfect 25 cards that are in this deck, and honestly, I'm not sure about the Blood Treant in this version of the deck, but Ashen Elemental, if you're worried about, like, the Tony Druid archetype or the Tony Druid matchup high-rolling you with, like, turn 4 combo, you have a way of being able to stop it now. And also, maybe it's really good into the mirror as well to stop, like, chamber draws, for example. Maybe that's the real reason why this is in the deck, but as a Tony Druid player, oh my god, this made me so freaking angry. But regardless, if you want to be the boogeyman on the ladder, if you want to be the legitimate villain of Hearthstone, play Discard Warlock. You probably don't have a lot more time to get value out of this deck before they eventually hotfix this, because I really do believe it is an emergency. They need to nerf this card. They need to yeet it from the Twist format. All you need to do is just make this a 3-2 instead of a 2-3, and then I think this card becomes a little bit more manageable. But you can't look at the stats and say this deck is not a problem. And in all honesty, if Discard Warlock was not ruling the ladder, then this deck definitely would be. Mech Paladin is still a powerhouse deck that I feel like a lot of people just aren't playing because they don't like the playstyle of this deck in particular. But, I mean, Mech Warpers, playing all of your minions, playing all of the value that you can with Galvanizer. This deck just makes a large amount of stats, and then if you get a Bubble Bot in order to stick your minions, then suddenly War Gear will just work absolute wonders in high-rolling this format. But if you want a simple aggro deck that can get a lot of wins and potentially can get 12 wins in the Brawlzeum, all the decks I'm recommending in Wild can get 12 wins, but this is just one of the decks that would be extremely powerful if Disco Warlock was not the #1 deck right now. And speaking of degeneracy, every single deck that I'm recommending in Wild, except for the Warrior deck, is absolutely degenerate in its own ways. And Frog Shaman with the Flash of Lightning, this deck is just crazy in terms of what it can do. I don't think I have to explain to the Wild community how good Spirit of the Frog is, because this card finds its way high-rolling metas every now and again. But now that we have Radiance and Flash of Lightning working together to discount cards like Crackle, Volcanic Burst, Storm's Wrath, Lightning Reflexes, Lightning Bolts, even like, I mean, you don't have to worry about discounting like Lightning Bloom and like Beakered Lightning, for example, but it all helps to discount the Crash of Thunder to 0 mana. You have ways of being able to discover spell damage off of the off of the lightning reflexes, but it's just, honestly, this deck is super powerful because almost every single card in it has overload, so it makes Overdraft deal ridiculous amounts of damage. So I would say that if you want to play a very degenerate combo deck that sometimes has some pretty difficult setup or good APM turns, this is probably the way to go. Getting 12 wins with this is probably really difficult, but the next deck I'm recommending is a combo deck to where once you know how to do the combo, it feels very easy to actually set it up and win the game. And that combo is Tony Druid. I actually played this for the very first time yesterday on stream, trying it out in the Brawlseum, and I ended up getting, you know, 2 5-win runs, but unfortunately Discard Warlock is a matchup to where you cannot misplay against. Like, case in point, there was a 3-2 that I could have killed with Moonfires, but I decided to be greedy for the combo, and honestly, I got punished for it. So the aggro matchup is going to be a little bit difficult, but if you go up against Warriors, it is such a free matchup. Due processes, naturalizes with the solar eclipses when you're at fatigue is how you win the game. The whole point of this deck is to draw through the entire deck thanks to Gadget Sin, and because you have Lifebinder's Gift turning your 1-drops into 0-drops, Gloop giving you extra mana, Biology Project giving you extra mana, Lightning Bloom and Innervates, and even Funnel Cakes giving you extra mana, this deck feels extremely broken if you know what you're doing with it. However, you have to be careful on how you use your Lifebinder's Gifts, because you have to be able to hit your Solar Eclipses and your Naturalizes in some instances. Because the way that you win, you draw out your deck, you go to Fatigue, you play the Tony, you play Solar Eclipse into Naturalizes, which I believe with their natural draw will make them deal 28 damage thanks to the Fatigue. But if you have Due Process already played, then you are killing any deck that just stays at 30. But if you're going up against Warrior, then having another Due Process and playing all of these cards that deal damage is sometimes necessary, because even Warrior can gain a surprising amount of armor, in all honesty. But I would say that this is the most fun combo deck you can be playing right now, just my own personal preference. But I love Gadgetzin decks, I love playing this deck, and when you see this deck played well, it makes you think twice, being like, wait a minute, do I really know how to play this deck? Because odds are there are ways that you can optimize every single game with it until you finally mastered it and you know exactly what you're doing with it. But man, Tony Druid was really fun for me. I highly recommend it if you love playing APM decks. Last and certainly not least is the Anyfin Warrior, which is really getting a lot of attention right now. And I think there's also a list from Martian Boo that is very equally powerful compared to this deck, but I would argue that the reason why I like this deck in particular is because of the ETC inclusion, giving these odd cards that can sometimes help. Barov for extra removal against potentially like a discard lock. You have this in order to give you a very real chance at being able to counter the Tony Druid, because if you play this card against Tony Druid, they're just going to simply die. There's no way they can stop this, or you delay the turn to where maybe you can set up like a lethal yourself. Rokara, I'm not 100% sure why this is in the deck outside of gaining 10 armor with Odyn. So if you play this after playing Odyn, you are essentially gaining 15 attack for 7 mana. So that kind of makes sense in some regards, but it's really insane to me how good this deck felt when I was playing it, and it has actual game against the Discard Warlock. You have Blade Storm in order to punish anyone that doesn't protect their Tiny Fin with another minion. You have Bashes, you have Dry Whisker Armorer, which feels really good against Discard Warlock if they go wide with the 2/1s. You have Rancor to gain even more armor. Hammer just feels really good as a 4/4 with the Corsair Cache. I feel like I need some more game with this deck in order to really recommend how to pilot it the best, but honestly, I like the single inclusions of this deck. The Trial by Fire helped me out a ton when I tried this deck on the Tavern Brawl. Again, I went 5 wins with it. I just couldn't get better than 5 wins no matter what deck I was playing. Rancor, obviously, I already said it was really good. The one copy of Corsair Cache should be able to draw the hammer. Everything else just makes so much sense. You know, Minefield to be able to control the early game. The Armorer works really well with the 1-mana hero power as a turn 3 play. You play the hammer, or you can play the ETC. Polkelt, I feel like, is a card that a lot of people are not giving enough attention to. But the main reason why you want this is not just to draw the Odyn, but to get that shield shatter that is super important against some of the aggro matchups. And then you have your Odyn and Trial by Fire almost guaranteed. Or maybe you get Galvangar in order to get an OTK, or to get the burst potential you need to win the game. I've talked about a lot of decks, so I'm starting to run out of gas. I've been recording this for about an hour, and now I gotta start editing it. So if you want to win in the Tavern Brawl, or if you want to win in Wild, I would recommend these 5 decks. But, oh man, does Wild really need some help right now? Because, just gonna speak from the heart, I don't want to be playing Wild right now in the state that it's in. It really does need some changes right now, and it really is because of Discard Warlock. Things need to get changed. I really hope that Blizzard listens to content creators on this one, because a lot of people are really dreading playing Wild right now. Even Wild creators such as Rothel and Martian Boo have made statements being like, I am dreading playing, like thinking of playing Wild going into my streams, because I know that it's going to be mostly Warlocks and mostly like uninteractive OTKs. So Blizzard, if you care at all about Wild, please do something as soon as possible, because I played it for the first time in a long time yesterday, and honestly, I don't think I'll be playing Wild again unless some massive changes happen. But there you go. Those are the top 5 decks to where you can get to Legend in Standard, or the top Legend decks in Standard, as well as Twist and Wild. So if you like this kind of content, like this video, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of stuff planned for this month and a lot of really cool ideas, and I have a lot of good news that I will be sharing when I eventually have the opportunity to share them. As of right now, it's got to be secrets because there's a perfect time for everything. It's just not right now. So thank you so much if you did make it to the end of this video. Go ahead and put a heart in the comment section if you did make it to this part of the video, so that way I see how many people actually do make it to the end of these deck breakdowns. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video of me just ranting about Hearthstone for an hour, and I'll see you on Twitch.